Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Every president since Bill Clinton has been struggling and trying to find a way to deal with a nuclear-armed North Korea. Diplomatic talks on various plans have been engaged in by every president from from Clinton right through Obama. And then came Donald Trump, who declared that, quote, talking doesn't work, end quote, and topping this off with the threat of fire and fury aimed at North Korea. To help us understand where we're at with this nuclear standoff with North Korea and where the United States is with its own nuclear weapons program, I'm really pleased to welcome to Other Voices JON RAINWATER, Executive Director of Peace Action and the Peace Action Education Fund. John, welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming down. John has, for over 30 years, John has been active in campaigns on issues of peace, nuclear disarmament, social justice, and environmental sustainability. And you've been with Peace Action for 30 years, was it, you said?
No, ever since the Iraq War, basically.
Oh, 13 years or so. Yeah. Take a minute or two for people who might not be familiar with Peace Action. It's one of the oldest disarmament groups in the country, is it not?
Absolutely, and one of the largest grassroots peace organization in the country. And we really, we're celebrating our 60th anniversary, and we started out as the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. So we were born early in the nuclear age, and we have focused on nuclear nonproliferation the entire time. But as time went on, our mission grew a bit to also focus on replacing a more militarist foreign policy with a diplomacy-first foreign policy, and to take a look at the military budget and advocate to shift resources from the bloated military Pentagon budget towards human needs. So that's our mission, and that's what we're doing.
Every one of these policy areas just got worse with the election of Donald Trump, didn't it? So
Absolutely.
You've got your work cut out for us. Well, you've been following this stuff closely. We're not even sure how close North Korea is, first of all, to actually being able to threaten the United States with a nuclear weapon. From your reading and analysis, how close would you say it is? Is it a direct threat yet? Is it a direct threat next month, next year?
Well, it's definitely too close. The North Koreans are moving actually at an impressive rate, if you want to look at it from a purely technological standpoint, to improve their systems. And they don't have systems that can reliably threaten the U.S. mainland, but a lot of intelligence experts feel like that maybe next year they would have those capabilities, certainly within the next 1 to 2 years. I think when looking at the threat, you have to analyze it and understand that in some ways having North Korea have nuclear weapons is as threatening as Russia having all of its nuclear weapons. So it's not something I'd go out and panic about if you haven't been panicking about the Russian nuclear threat. But any time a country gains nuclear weapons, it is very daunting and scary. The one thing I would emphasize that scares me the most is not just the technological advancement, but the conflict that's going on between the United States and North Korea, the anger being expressed, the threats, and that could spiral out of control. And that combined with nuclear technology is very, very dangerous.
To me, it's one of the most striking differences between Trump and all three of the presidents that preceded him when it came to dealing with the nuclear threat from North Korea, in that Kim would make some outrageous statement or a missile test, and it was almost like he got the cold shoulder and was ignored. Is Trump playing right into his hands with this kind of
I think he is.
tweeting rhetoric of
I think he's playing into Kim's hands in terms of strengthening the regime and making the North Korean people feel like they need that sort of protection. But worse still, he's playing into a perception that North Koreans have, and frankly have earned, that the United States is out to get them. You have to go back to the to the Korean War, really, where the United States decimated that country, destroyed whole villages and cities, millions of Koreans died. And that's the lens through which they see this conflict. So that when Donald Trump threatens them through a tweet or through a statement, or frankly, what I'm concerned about is when someone like Secretary Mattis threatens obliquely with a statement about being able to totally annihilate that country, we're playing into the perception of the North Koreans that we are out to get them, and that really fuels the conflict even more.
Yeah, the Korean War is practically forgotten in this country, but it certainly has not been forgotten in North Korea.
Absolutely, and what the Kim propaganda machine does, it reminds North Koreans of that every single time one of these threats happens from the United States. How dare you threaten us with fire and fury? Look at what you did in the Korean War. And so these type of fire and fury comments are really fueling that feeling of insecurity that is driving in some ways, the nuclear weapons program. So it's really counterproductive.
Yeah, and blurting out that nuclear battleships are on the way, even though they really weren't. And his UN ambassador saying that Kim is practically begging for a war. What do you think Kim's ultimate goal is? Is it he's so often portrayed as a madman who would irrationally use nuclear weapons. And I've had people on this program who say he's looking for a deterrent because there's tens of thousands of U.S. troops just south of his border and nuclear-armed ships just off his coast. Where do you come down on the madman theory and what his ultimate goal is?
Well, I agree with some of those folks. I don't think he's a madman. And as importantly, the people around him are very serious people. Let's be clear, it's a very brutal regime. But these are people who are rational people. You know, I've talked to a lot of diplomats who've worked with them, and they think that they are looking after, as you pointed out, their own security. It's deterrence from an invasion. We said they were part of the axis of evil. We invaded Iraq. We invaded Libya. That sent a certain message to the Kim regimes. But on top of that, they also just want that leverage and strength. So if, God forbid, there was a conflict between South Korea and North Korea, if they have the ability to hit the U.S. mainland, the United States' ability to intervene in that conflict is also reduced. So it's about enhancing North Korean security, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a key point in that if there's a North-South conflict, you would expect the United States, which already has a lot of troops there, to send more and send weapons. And in fact, one of the things we're apparently doing is sending even more weapons now. But to remove that element from any kind of Korean war, it seems to be a pretty reasonable goal.
Absolutely, and I think really
rational is what I.
Yeah, and I think that points out that the only way to address this in the long term, there's a lot we can do in the short term to reduce tensions, to start to move towards a lessening of tensions, but in the long term, if we actually wanted to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, if we want some of these conflicts to go away, we need to finally have a peace treaty between the North and the South. That war has never formally ended.
Yeah.
And we also need a new security architecture within that region, or there's always going to be a danger of conflict.
What would this new security architecture look like?
Well, there are a lot of ideas that are brainstormed out there, and that's, I think, we have to go to the table. One thing you could do is start with a freeze, where the United States and South Korea would freeze some of their military exercises in the region, really decrease them. That's something the North Koreans feel very threatened by. And perhaps in exchange, and the North Koreans have hinted they'd be willing to do this, the North Koreans would freeze their missile development and nuclear testing programs. Then once you get to the table, you can talk about various ideas. Those ideas run from normalization of relationships, signing the peace treaty, to an actual nuclear weapons free zone in Northeast Asia that would apply not only to North Korea, but in the long term to Japan and South Korea. And so there are a lot of ideas that you can go to the table with, but until you get to the table, you don't know what's possible.
Let's stay on the idea of this mutual freeze, and first the U.S. role in carrying out these war games, practice invasions of the North, basically, with South Korea. Those are they annual or semi-annual, and then they suddenly come up with reasons to do more practicing when tensions start to rise. Talk about the role they play, and what would the U.S. be giving up anything by freezing these war game exercises?
Well, there are multiple types, as you're alluding to, of exercises, and there's a pair each year, like you say, that are very important. And North Korea finds them extremely threatening. Not only do they practice invasions, but lately they've been rumored in the Japanese and South Korean press to be practicing quote unquote decapitation actions, which is not going to make Mr. Kim very hopeful of reducing tensions. So those are very destabilizing. There are a number of things the United States could do to preserve the benefits of those war games without actually engaging in the type of activities they're engaging in. You can do seminars to get some of the training benefit of those war games without telegraphing that it's a war game and doing a ton of strategic media around it to show off and beat your chest that you're doing these war games. So there's a lot that the United States could do with
computer simulation of war games?
A lot of things that could be done that would really reduce tensions without the U.S. really losing anything. Having said that, we may have to give up something to gain something if we're really going to freeze the nuclear program.
That's the way negotiations. While we're on this give and take, what have been some of the past agreements that have actually been reached between the U.S. and North Korea? Bill Clinton, they got the program frozen for a while.
Exactly, and that's where Donald Trump's recent tweet saying that 25 years of talk hasn't achieved anything is just wrong. And by the way, again, it's not just Donald Trump. You had the Secretary of State meeting with his counterpart in South Korea using very similar messaging about 20 years of talk hasn't amounted to anything, and we gave them billions of dollars of aid, and all we got was nuclear testing. And that really distorts the history. What happened was, during the Clinton administration, there was negotiations, and in 1994, they put together something called the Agreed Framework. And as you're pointing out, that froze their plutonium nuclear weapons development program for 8 years. I mean, it was basically shut down and frozen. And it wasn't perfect. The Republicans in Congress really fought against it. And so on our end, we were slow in delivering some of the benefits like energy support. And the kicker that people point to is that North Korea also skirted at least the spirit of the deal by looking into developing a uranium capacity that would allow them to take that path to nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't get very far, and we could have repaired that, but people like John Bolton used that, as he said, I'm going to use this as a hammer to destroy the agreed framework. That's what he did, and the Bush administration walked away, and we got, the thing fell apart, and we got a nuclear weapons test eventually by the North Koreans.
During the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And just run through Obama's record. He didn't have any major breakthroughs, clearly, but was there anything unique tried during the Obama administration?
Well, let me criticize one thing that had nothing directly to do with North Korea that I think was a huge mistake, just to put it out there. The invasion of Libya, I think Secretary Clinton and President Obama may regret as we look at this, because it's that type of thing. Here was a country or a regime that gave up a weapons of mass destruction program, and then we ended up invading and removing that person. That's part of the driver for Kim, as we've been discussing. But on top,
He, or at least some of his top-ranking officials, have directly referred to that incident of Libya. Have they not?
That's exactly right. And it's the same with Iraq. John Bolton said, we hope that Kim Jong-il takes seriously the message of the Iraq invasion. Well, he took it seriously, and that's why he tested a nuclear weapon, sadly. But in terms of the Obama administration, he had a policy of strategic patience. It didn't really amount to much. And there was even a point at which North Korea came forward and said, let's negotiate. And the Obama administration said, we don't take seriously this offer. So the Obama administration, I think a part of it may have been they were very focused on the Iran deal. That was enough political hazard to take on, given the heat they got for the Iran deal, and they really
Still taking.
And in fact, that deal could fall apart next month. Trump is really looking to torpedo it, and if that falls apart, how are we going to negotiate with the North Koreans over their nuclear program when we had this agreement and we abrogate it? And
Yeah, who would sign an agreement with this administration
exactly,
that's busy unsigning agreements
exactly,
of major importance?
And there are other agreements like the New START treaty with Russia that the Trump administration is talking about getting rid of as well. So this torpedoing, no pun intended, of nuclear agreements is really the worst possible thing when it comes to figuring out what to do with North Korea.
And the UN's role in this, in the Security Council, they had an emergency meeting. They're probably continuing to meet behind closed doors to try to forge some kind of statement or maybe even action on sanctions. What's your read on what's happening at the UN and what effect that might have?
Well, the current UN approach, I think, embodies the problem with the Trump administration's approach to quote unquote diplomacy, whereas it's all about coercion. All they really focus on mainly is sanctions, with this notion that if we just pile on sanctions heavily enough, the Kim regime will buckle and somehow magically they'll agree to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. That's never going to happen. I mean, at best, and I don't even believe this, you're going to be enhancing your position once you get to the bargaining table. But they may be wasting precious time by just focusing on the sanctions regime. And given the nature of the Kim regime and how closely it controls the economy of North Korea, they have buffers that allow them to absorb the sanctions without changing. That's why they've done this for decades. So even if it was the embargo of oil, which is what they're talking about today, the regime has stockpiled oil for the military. That would not hurt the nuclear program at all. It wouldn't hurt the warfighting machine. It would hurt the people of North Korea. So even that most powerful economic tool is not likely to cause the North Koreans to knuckle under.
And the oil, most of North Korea's oil comes via China, correct? So let's talk about China's role in this, because they're a major player. When you're talking about your only point of pressure is economic sanctions, I think the number I'm remembering is 83% of North Korea's international trade is with China. So you're really talking about China bringing the pressure, which they are loath to do for a number of reasons. Talk about how they fit into this puzzle, because they're a key here.
Well, they are key, and it's important that U.S. diplomacy not get overly self-centered. And so there's been this attitude that because China has that leverage, we're going to sort of outsource the solution to China, when in fact China has its own interests. And the interests here that get in the way of China just coming down ridiculously hard on North Korea is they want stability. This is their border. So for example, if they cut off oil and that causes real economic hardship, like deprivation for the North Koreans, as if they haven't suffered enough already, the civilians, they could have refugees streaming across the border. So the last thing they want, the Chinese, from their own security perspective, is destabilization of North Korea. So that gives the amount of room for them to operate in terms of coming down on North Korea a lot less than certainly the Trump administration acts like sometimes.
Do they also China see a threat in a unified Korean that leans toward the West and the U.S.?
Absolutely. I mean, they don't want U.S. troops near the border of China.
How many troops do we have there? Do you know?
I don't off the top.
I think it's around 10,000 or so, but I'm not sure.
More than that, but
37,000.
37,000?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, there's kind of a lot of bad scenarios for China. On the one hand, chaos is bad. On the other hand, a unified North Korea, you know, in a certain way at least, is bad for them. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. They don't want a North Korea with nuclear weapons advancing. This is actually a chance for them to show the international community that they can deliver if they were able to put pressure on North Korea without destabilizing it in a way that got North Korea to roll back its programs. But they're not going to gamble on some of those other scenarios.
Where do you see this going in the immediate future? Because these talks, these reasonable trade-offs that you talked about, I don't see them coming out of this administration.
Well, the administration has had contacts with the North Koreans, and so there have been some reports that the administration actually knows what the parameters of a solution would be, including things like a negotiated treaty or end to the war between North Korea and South Korea. So I think they know what it takes to actually solve this problem. But whether they have the political wherewithal is another question. So the first thing that I would like to see, I don't know what will happen, is a reduction of this sort of warmongering rhetoric that you mentioned, the ambassador to the UN. We can't make those kind of ultimatums and set up going to the negotiating table. If the diplomats are allowed to do their job, I think even people in the Trump administration know what some of the recipe for a solution is, but the rhetoric has to stop from some of the higher ups for that to happen.
We've heard a lot about the State Department being woefully understaffed. Have you read anything that it directly impacts the situation with North Korea?
Well, not exactly, and I personally, I'm just speaking for myself here, feel torn because some of the understaffing, you still have Obama administration officials who are holdovers, and in some ways, on certain days, I'd prefer
so
that.
Some of it is good, yes.
But it certainly makes it harder when you don't have ambassadors and those sorts of things. I'm frankly nervous about who they put into those positions as well. So there's a little bit of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, and I'm wondering who they might bring in as a North Korea expert, seeing the experts that, like the Environmental Protection Agency, are bringing in.
Exactly.
I do want to move on to domestic nuclear weapon plans, but before we leave North Korea for this section, is there anything what are you calling on peace action supporters and members to be doing around this North Korea issue? What can grassroots activists do to kind of impact this?
Well, I think if you look at the Iran deal, you saw the power of the grassroots with a simple message that we want diplomacy, not war. I think that's a message with broad appeal. There are even some Republicans that can support it. And if you look out there, although there are some voices in Congress for diplomacy, we need those people who have a bully pulpit that's larger than ours to speak out. So I think grassroots needs to pressure every member of Congress at town halls. You watch all these videos of people getting slammed for If they go the wrong way on healthcare, they should also be slammed if they go the wrong way on diplomacy with North Korea. So getting in the face of members of Congress, pushing them to embrace diplomacy, pushing for a freeze to start diplomacy, and then pushing for long-term solutions, I think that's what the grassroots can do.
Yeah, I think it was Rex Tillerson back in spring who described the U.S. program toward North Korea as maximum pressure and engagement. And I think those are always good words for the grassroots when it comes to your congressional leaders.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take a quick look at what's happening with our own nuclear weapons program here in the United States, and we've done programs on this. President Obama left us plans for a $1 trillion 10-year modernization of our whole nuclear complex. Can you describe what's involved in this package in less than 3 hours?
I'll try. I mean, basically, it looks at the entire nuclear enterprise and refurbishes it from top to bottom, makes it 21st century, very expensive. So it's the entire nuclear weapons triad, the submarines, the bombers, the ICBMs. It's all of the nuclear weapons labs. It's new weapons capabilities. And all of that adds up to, and now in the Trump administration, we had that nice slogan of stop the $1 trillion boondoggle. It's now a $1.2 billion boondoggle. Trillion. I mean, excuse me, trillion. So the price tag is going up, but it's basically everything being refurbished.
Modernized and refurbished. Yeah. Does this mean a new generation of weapons? Are they developing new nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some debate over where the line is between something that's completely rebuilt in a different way and what's a new nuclear weapon. But let me give you an example that we're very concerned about, and that's the so-called long-range standoff weapon, which is a new air-launched nuclear cruise missile. They just awarded $1.8 billion for that weapon, and that's just for the development phase. It's going to be a total of $20 to $30 billion for just that missile. And the problem we have with the missile is not that it just costs way too much and robs all sorts of programs, but first of all, it's completely redundant. Doesn't give us anything we don't already have with other weapons. But most importantly, it's incredibly destabilizing, because when a cruise missile is fired at you, when you see it on the radar, if you're the receiving country, you have no idea whether it's a conventional weapon or a nuclear weapon, and it could start a nuclear war in that way. And so these are the type of weapons that are on the block being put forward: ridiculously expensive, unneeded, and destabilizing. And there are many, many ways in which that's true with the entire package.
And clearly here there's a lot of room for grassroots activism, because Congress is going to have to pay for all of this and vote on it at some point, probably in different pieces as it goes along.
That's exactly right. And every year when they pass the appropriations budgets and the defense authorization, there are amendments offered to make cuts, so people can always be involved in that way. And Peace Action tracks all of those votes very closely to try to build a movement to cut these weapons.
Is that this kind of information available on your website?
Absolutely, peaceaction.org. And I mean, one thing I would say about the grassroots here is that there's an opportunity here. When it was the $1 trillion under Obama, you sadly had Democrats willing to go along with it because it was a Democratic president. I think with Trump, there are two ways in which the grassroots can make hay in order to cut these things. First of all, just good old partisanship, as much as we might dislike it, is an opportunity here to get Democrats to oppose this because they're being proposed by a Republican president. Second of all, people with some reason think that Trump is kind of nuts. And, you know, with his finger, his Twitter finger close to the button, we shouldn't be spending all this money on nuclear weapons. So it's a rationale for cutting nuclear weapons. It's also a rationale for looking at nuclear policies. So, for example, we're supporting a bill that would take away the first use of nuclear weapons, or at least what it actually does is it has Congress have to vote before the president can authorize a first-use nuclear strike.
That's the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act. That's H.R. 669. We've done alerts on that,
Great.
petitions and letter writing. Where does that stand?
Well, it's actually gaining a lot of, after the Fire and Fury comments, the co-sponsorships for those bills started to go up. So there is this relationship between some of these efforts in Congress and the attention that they're getting because of what Trump is saying. So we as activists have to jump on that and really make those numbers rise. And long term, if we can make those numbers rise in response to what Trump's saying, we're building the movement long term, I think, to change the policy. Because one person, whether it's Trump or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or anyone else, should not be able to press a button and start a nuclear war. So this is an opportunity to make that case.
And just to follow up on that, like I said, we did do that, and we sent a letter signed by a couple hundred local people over to our local representative, Anna Eshoo. Mm-hmm. And just last week, I got a response from her. It was a non-response. We were asking her to go co-sponsor this, add her name to the list to help move it along. Mm-hmm. And she wrote back and thank you for the information and kind of laid out the situation, but it was one of these typical no responses, and she's not becoming a co-sponsor. What's holding up some Democrats from co-sponsoring this? Do you have any read on that?
There might be a number of reasons. I mean, some of it is just wanting to continue to support a strong military, sadly. Mm-hmm. And that's where grassroots activists have to make it clear to Democratic politicians that being strong on defense, quote unquote, in a way that only mimics Republican hawkishness is not a viable political strategy.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be Anna Eshoo's history. She's mm-hmm. very good on nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. This one really baffled me. I haven't had a chance to follow up with their office yet. I want to get to our in-studio audience here and their questions and comments and thoughts. But let me just ask you, what's your feeling of kind of the state of the national anti-nuclear movement or nuclear disarmament movement? It's one that has had peaks and valleys, and we've been through a lot of valleys with it recently. Do you think all this tension with North Korea is getting people's attention again, or just the fact that we have a guy with an itchy trigger finger in the White House is getting the attention again?
I think it has the potential to do that. I think one thing we can do is step back and look at the global anti-nuclear movement. And we just did globally have a major, major victory with the nuclear prohibition treaty at the UN. Yeah. And so now, formally, nuclear weapons have been made illegal.
Describe the process a little bit for people who aren't.
Basically, there's been a process for a number of years for a treaty that would formally ban nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty said that there had to be negotiations to ban nuclear weapons, but that didn't happen. So this was an effort by the non-nuclear weapon states to just say nuclear weapons are outlawed, testing nuclear weapons are outlawed, having nuclear weapons on your territory is outlawed. And the fly in the ointment here is none of the nuclear weapons states engaged in this treaty. But what it does is it just continues to solidify the norm against nuclear weapons. So if South Korea is saying, and we think a very bad idea, well, we need tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil in order to parry the nuclear weapon threat of North Korea, you can point to this sort of thing. But more importantly, you can point to the trillion-dollar nuclear boondoggle and say, all of these countries are against this. So it's an opportunity to just push globally for nuclear disarmament. And so, U.S. movement, I think, can support that by pressing for that in the United States, but at the same time press on the other things that you're mentioning, like the $1 trillion boondoggle, or the $1.2 trillion.
1.2 trillion now.
And on Trump having his itchy Twitter finger on the nuclear button as well. And I think when you put all of that together, there are some opportunities. So will it be like it was during the nuclear freeze movement? Maybe not, but we need to take it up a notch in response to the issue with North Korea and these other issues. And I think that is a possible goal if people join in.
Yeah, I would hope, if nothing else, a re-energized nuclear disarmament movement will come out of all this craziness with North Korea. All right, let's get our audience in on this. The way this works is you need to wait for a microphone to arrive, which Crystal will be bringing around. So just raise your hand if you have a question or comment, and we would ask you to, Crystal, they're all, she's heading over that side, and all the hands came up on this side. So if you would stand up and make it a little easier on our camera operators, that would be great. Yes, sir.
Enjoyed your commentary very much.
Hold it very close.
I enjoyed your commentary very much. But it was, I think, within the last 4 or 5 months that North Korea was not experiencing a great deal of success with missile launches. Then suddenly they've really gotten on a pretty good string of successes. It was suggested that this quick change might have been the result of help from another country, and I think they were suggesting, in fact, that it might have been the Ukraine. I would think that help from any other country would be interesting to know about, and what's it all mean?
Who's helping North Korea? We don't know, I'm sure.
I am not privy to that, and there may be alternative explanations. I don't have a perfect sense of that, but there are periods where something takes a long time and then it does speed up for whatever reason. But I think noticing that things have sped up is absolutely accurate, and it is very, as I alluded to when you're going in depth on, it is impressive at the progress they've been able to make. So that's a good question. What caused that?
I think the news story that he's referring to, I heard this too, and like so many news stories these days, it got buried under an avalanche of reporting on tweets and stuff. But that some scientists had identified from some film and stuff the rocket parts, and they seem to be a Ukrainian design. And the implication of I think it was NPR where I heard it on the radio, was that these were stolen somehow from the Ukraine manufacturer, which is really almost out of business now, and that it wasn't official Ukrainian government. The company says they don't know anything about it, but it does seem to be kind of verified that it looks like a reasonable assumption that they're using some kind of Ukraine design, whether they got stolen plans or something like that. North Korea is always out looking for stuff on the black market, not only to get around sanctions, but to advance their missile program.
Well, this was there were important programs after the fall of the Soviet Union to address this sort of thing, both the loose fissile material, the various technologies, and the scientists themselves. There were programs, the Nunn-Lugar program in the United States, and part of it was to actually pay the scientists so they didn't go out and look for
the highest bidder.
The highest bidder.
Yeah.
And people had the same concerns in Iraq and Libya. So I think it's a good point that we should be, there's a way of looking at this through a non-proliferation lens, that whether it's the materials, the technology, or the scientists themselves, we should we, the global community that cares about nonproliferation, should be trying to bottle that up as much as possible. But there's always possibility that it can get through.
Yeah, yeah, the genie out of the bottle sort of thing. Okay, there's another question right in the front row here, Crystal.
I'd like to shift the focus of discussion from North Korea to Russia, who I believe is the only other nation that has a significant nuclear capability. During the Cold War, as we know, there was nuclear parity, which ironically gave the world a more stable order, in spite of what may appear. Reading the interview with Putin by Oliver Stone, I get the impression that Putin is giving top priority to strengthening their nuclear capability, and that he's confident of reaching it before long. What is your own take on Russia?
Excellent question, thank you.
Well, I think there's a real danger here that the United States is not going to engage with Russia with an aim to have more agreements that prevent that sort of situation. I think we have a global nuclear arms race in its early stages, and I think Russia and the United States are a big part of that. And unfortunately, the Trump administration is going in the absolute opposite direction and talking about getting rid of the New START treaty, INF treaty, etc. So it's a real problem.
Okay, here in the center aisle, center of the aisle.
Yeah. South Korean leaders have mostly talked about wanting discussions to go on, and it seems like the United States administration mostly ignores what they're saying. Can you comment on the relationship between the United States and South Korea in regard to dealing with North Korea?
Well, the current president, President Moon, is very clear that he wants not only diplomacy with North Korea, but he wants some more full engagement with North Korea economically, etc. And of course, Trump recently tweeted a very insulting tweet about South Korea that really doesn't help things, as saying that they were into appeasement because they were talking about diplomacy. And appeasement, ironically, is the word that the Bush administration used when they walked away from the table with North Korea that caused North Korea to get a nuclear weapon. I think there are obviously contacts happening between the United States and South Korea at a lower diplomatic level where they're trying to work closely together. But when Trump's making these sort of remarks, it doesn't help.
When Moon, the new president, Moon Jae-in, took office in South Korea, one of the first things he said was that he didn't want the THAAD missile system that had been sent there. It's Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, and these are apparently ground-based missiles that are supposed to shoot down a rocket on launch, like a nuclear ICBM headed towards Los Angeles. But now he seems to be reversing himself on that?
At least for the time being, in response to the recent tests, unfortunately.
Yeah. Is this going to be more destabilizing? China, for one thing, does not want those there because they have missiles too. And this can be seen as kind of an offensive weapon.
And at the same time that we want China to be putting pressure on North Korea. The Chinese are actually as concerned about the radar that comes with that system as they are about the missiles, because the United States can use that to look at what China is doing in any conflict between the United States and China. So there's games within games within games here. And President Moon had been talking about an environmental process to look at the the missile interceptors and whether they should be there, but it did sound like he was changing his mind after this recent test. But he's obviously concerned about his more peace-loving base. So those people in South Korea need to speak up.
Yeah. And in terms of, to follow up on the question of relationships with between the U.S. and South Korea, at the same time, incredibly, that all this is going on, Trump is talking about pulling out of the U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement. Not related, but not very diplomatic.
No, it's crazy to look at that. I mean, the timing is mind-boggling, if nothing else.
Yeah. What we need is Twitter disarmament, and things would go a long way, I think. Do we have some more questions or comments in the audience? Oh, lots of them. So come on up here, and we'll just work our way across.
So my question is
Hold it up a little
long-term,
closer.
really long-term. And my objection is to American politicians that consider us exceptional, somehow beyond the normal, what's expected of nations. Is there any way or any small part of our whole domain where we could seek something that is common to all? It could be food, it could be health, it could be something that we say, okay, we're in this for the long term, and you, North Korea, are a part of it. So let's work together on health or food or whatever.
How about climate change?
That's what I was going to say. I think expecting, or not expecting, but the Trump administration is not necessarily going to be the best time to push something like that forward, but we can start to build a movement here in the United States for that kind of thing. I certainly think climate change is a global problem, where if the United States steps up and leads, that starts to build people's recognition of how we're all in this together and we have common threats. And we really need to redefine the meaning of security. Some people talk about a different approach as human security. So also there are natural disasters, there's climate change, of course they're related, there's famine, and if the global community can come together and redefine security as about what protects human lives, I think that's critical. The other thing that your comment reminds me of is just as a country, a recognition, sort of the opposite of that almost narcissistic approach to perceiving things, is to recognize things like that the Korean War happened and that we decimated that country. We bombed many cities to rubble. And if we can acknowledge those sorts of things, like President Obama acknowledged the CIA's involvement in the coup in Iran prior to the Iran negotiations, if we can humble ourselves a little bit as a nation and acknowledge some of our mistakes, I think that gets at that exceptionality problem as well. So those are a couple ways, I think.
Yeah, that's not something that Trump is going to do, certainly. Okay, next in line.
So I'm very worried about Rex Tillerson. Do you think he's able to be a good Secretary of State? And the diplomacy is so important, but somehow he's not getting the press or the, does he have good ideas, and is he someone that we should support, or is he just going along with the Trump ideas and not able to be his own initiator?
I think it's hard to tell. I definitely think there are people within the State Department and within the diplomatic corps who know what it would take to craft a diplomatic solution. I mean, there have been some leaks, and when you look at the elements of what they think it would take, that there are some of the right elements, like ending the war between North and South, normalization of relations. It's actually all there in the agreed framework that the Clinton administration put together. So career diplomats can look at that and see that framework and pursue it with the North Koreans. But what you're seeing now, I think we know a little bit more what's going on with the Iran deal, where Tillerson and others are trying to preserve the Iran deal, and people, particularly within the White House, and Trump himself want to decertify Iran, which would be a step towards unraveling of the Iran deal. So you can see that tension. It's a little bit more visible, I think, on the Iran deal than it is with North Korea, but I'm sure there's some similar dynamics going there. But I do think some of those career diplomats under Tillerson, and there are a lot of vacancies and Obama holdovers that might leave, but they know what the parameters look like. And so we have to push for that. I think we can do that through Congress largely and get Congress to stand up for those things, ideally with Republican voices as well as Democratic voices, and that might push Tillerson in the right direction.
All right, and there was another question down this way.
Thank you, John, for coming today. I have two questions. The first question is, what do you think the probability is, whether through error or through strategy, of there being a war between North Korea and the United States? Then an easier question, which is, back a decade or two ago when we were going through the six-party talks with North Korea, one of the objections that North Korea had was that they really wanted to speak directly to the United States. They didn't want any part to do with six-party talks. They wanted two-party talks, U.S. and North Korea. Now that seems hardly likely based on the likelihood of a stalemate between the two parties. But then the issue of China comes up. China is an intermediary and a moderator. So why don't we ask China to be the intermediary? What do you think of that?
Good questions. On the probability, I should probably not hazard a guess on that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that really scares me is that the Trump administration is sort of burning its bridges behind them by saying, using the "this will not stand" language, and creating basically, they're drawing the red line over and over again. Trump, unfortunately, did it on ICBMs in his January tweet, and they've already crossed that line, one could argue. But as the North Korean program progresses, it's hard to perceive that if there isn't any success in rollbacks, that Trump won't feel boxed in. So I think that makes it look to me like we could be on a path to war, but I don't want to give it a probability. I don't feel that confident. I think ideally there would be both bilateral and multilateral talks. We need both. There is some contact between the United States and North Koreans at a somewhat low level, and there have been hints that that opening could grow and it could move up the chain to higher level contacts. And again, you mentioned the six-party talks. Also during the Clinton administration, there were pretty high level contacts. So I think we would want to move there, and that's critical, but I also wouldn't hesitate to get to the table in a multilateral way that did work with Iran. As you point out, it's a little bit different than with North Korea because they're scared of the United States and pretty cut and dried. So, but maybe both would be good. But if China can broker that opening, that would be great.
I believe Switzerland has recently offered to try to mediate this, but I haven't seen any follow-up on that. Have you seen anything more than they're making the offer?
No, and sometimes these things happen in secret, as the initial U.S.-Iranian contacts did.
That was a very interesting story how that came about, because we had no diplomatic relations with Iran at all, and yet here was this incredible nuclear agreement at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it started with secret bilateral negotiations between the United States and Iran. So their bilateral was critical. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of that's not happening now. But I think that while we wait to see what's going on, the activist community should just be pressuring politicians to call for that, and that supports the diplomatic path. The larger there is a call for peace, the more political space I think we create in Congress and even within the administration for the diplomatic path.
I'm glad you returned to that point, because this is how grassroots activism works a lot of times. There's no specific goal other than elevating an issue to the top of the agenda list.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, during the Iran deal, it wasn't like the activists were out there saying, well, the Iranians should have this many centrifuges, no more, no less, or this is what should happen with the plutonium path, this is what should happen with the uranium path. It was just, we don't want war. This is a choice between diplomacy and war. We expect you, my representative, to vote for diplomacy and not war, or to support diplomacy, not war. And it's a simple message like that that can punch through, and I think what we need right now, and I wish more Democratic politicians and Republican would be carrying that message, but we have to push them to.
And speaking out, what's Peace Action going to do next on this? Just continue asking people to contact Congress with that message, or?
Absolutely, and we're working a lot in the media to shape the debate, to get these various messages out there, whether it's the history with North Korea and the Korean War, which we think is essential for the public debate, or the possible political and diplomatic paths forward. We want to highlight all of that.
Just quickly, how do you think the media coverage has been of this? There's a terrible tendency in our mainstream media to beat the drums for war, and there's certainly a lot of the rhythm section is quite loud. You seen that in the reflected in the media at all?
Absolutely. I mean, there's good reporting, but it's kind of how it all gets framed. At the center of the frame, you have, Kim is a crazy person. The weapons are going to be able to hit Los Angeles. They're going to be able to hit Chicago. And the good reporting is kind of at the margins. You can find it in the mainstream media, I think, but it's not kind of that drumbeat. And so I'm very nervous about what's in the media right now.
All right, we're going to have to let it go there. Jon Rainwater, Executive Director of Peace Action, thanks so much for joining us here today. And thank you all for joining us. We should be okay.
Okay.